I'm going to talk about temporal variability, mostly on seasonal timescales, but as you're going to see, there are actually a variety of timescales that we have to consider, and I'll try to give a few examples of those so that we can work them into our discussion sections. So I just wanted to acknowledge up front that I've benefited from a whole range of collaborators over the years, and many of you will become your collaborators one with another, and any of these people could have been included as co-authors on this presentation. So I'll follow the lead of Jaap and using this ternary diagram that represents the different forcing functions that help to dictate how deltas form and what their shapes and sizes are in any given case, the relative importance of river supply, discharge of water and sediment, wave energy along the coast, tides, and so forth. And what's missing here, obviously, and I'm sure many of you immediately locked in on it, is temperature. Anyway, one of the things that's obviously missing here is temperature, and radiation is what I was trying to think of. So in fact, a ternary diagram for biogeochemical purposes should really be a pentagon or a pentagonal diagram. But I'm going to lock in on the ternary diagram and these factors because, as you noted from the title, I'm going to emphasize tropical systems where temperature and radiation are relatively fixed seasonally. Those aren't variables that we need to consider, but we do in other systems. And my emphasis is going to be on subaqueous sedimentary facies. So in your delta doodle, you'll be able to emphasize that with respect to what I'm talking about here. I'm going to talk about natural processes rather than human perturbations, which are obviously extremely important in these systems. And that's a subject unto its own right. So I'm going to talk about the time-dependent drivers of different aspects of sedimentary biogeochemistry, sediment-water exchange, and import and export from these systems. Now, one of the things that you need to realize is that the material that enters deltas determine to a very large degree how they respond biogeochemically to perturbations. So they reflect the material that's delivered along the margins of these continental regions is determined by what happens in the drainage basin, and it varies in different systems. And I'm going to talk about the Amazon today and a system in Papua New Guinea, the Gulf of Papua. And these represent different regions with very different types of reactant mixtures delivered to the ocean. However, one of the most important properties that is common to these two systems that I'll be talking about is they deliver a lot of reactive iron on the surfaces of the particles. If you measure the bulk iron in this system, they don't vary that much from non-tropical river systems. But the surface iron phases on the particles that are delivered are heavily enriched in iron oxides due to the weathering in the drainage basins. And then in the case of New Guinea, Papua New Guinea, there's a lot of volcanoclastic material that's also introduced. So you get this funny mix of very immature basaltic material along with heavily weathered material from the drainage basin. And so this material generated in the drainage basin enters the sea, and you've already seen this picture. Shoily showed part of it, and enters the sea. And you can see that there are, from the green color here, there's intense productivity typically along these boundaries of deltaic regions as the water enters the ocean, the sediment's resuspended, and you get intense autochthonous production of reactants together with intense introduction of allochthonous reactants from the land. And this is the mixing zone between the two. And I'm going to talk about some of the consequences momentarily. Now, in your delta doodle, I want you to use this schematic diagram, which I love. Obviously, this is meant to be a cross-section from the shoreline into the deeper water here. And it shows schematically a typical type of deltaic cliniform. And it's meant to show you functionally how parts of this cliniform operate. This part we call the foreset, also sometimes included in the pro-delta, is the large storage part of the system. We have typically a shallow, extremely energetic region that's really impacted tremendously by seasonal processes, which I'm going to get into in a moment. And we have sand bodies, typically closer to shore, which is one of the topics I'm going to bring up in the workshops, that we know very little about how these sand regions function in these systems. People stay away from them. They're difficult to sample. And so they just, there's not much carbon there, but when you look in detail at them, they process a hell of a lot of carbon. It just doesn't get stored there. So I'll be talking about this region as the topset region, as the processing region of the system, and then the foreset as the storage region. And so diagrammatically, many of you have seen this before, but I know that there's a spectrum of people here who may not have. And so I wanted to show these figures, these schematic figures, as introductory background. So this is looking down on the system rather than a cross section. The first thing I showed you was a cross here, then looking vertically. And so now you're looking in plan view, a typical, say, in the case of the tropics, mangrove fringe environments, the sand body regions close to shore, a broad shelf, a shallow region, the topset region. This is the processing region for carbon. There's a heck of a lot of remineralization in these parts of the system. They're very efficient incinerators of everything that enters them. And then whatever's left, eventually, a lot of it gets stored out here on the high sedimentation regions of decliniform. So I'll talk about some of this. Now, obviously, the geometry doesn't look like this at all, right? It's all funny and misshapen depending on the deltaic system you're in. But functionally, this is the kind of pattern you very typically get. So one of the take-homes I'd like you to get is that parts of the system really respond to forcing, temporal forcing, differently. Okay, it's just not a uniform response to, oh, you push here and everything responds. Part of it responds and part doesn't. And so it really varies. The response you see to different forcing functions depends on where you are in the system. So I want to start with the Amazon Guiana system. Along this part of the axis is the date here. So January is here, obviously, and December's over here in a typical year. And a lot of things change in the Amazon Delta system yearly. One is, you can see up here, the sediment discharge here, that black line. That's the temporal pattern of sediment delivery to the deltaic system. The water discharge, you can see, varies. The sediment delivery leads the water discharge. That's very, very typical. So the system gets flushed as the water hydrograph rises. That's quite normal. And then the whole system relaxes during a part of the year. And so I'll talk about some of the behavior of the Amazon sediment regions at different stages of the river, but also different stages of the wind system. You see there's monthly wind stress that on this area varies substantially from one part of the year to the next, and they're due to the easterly trade winds in this part of the world, okay? And so both the direction, the slight direction, and the magnitude of the winds change. So on the ternary diagram, what we're going to see here is a phasing of different forces in different parts of the system in time, and a magnitude variation of the forcing functions in different parts of the system as a function of time. The other thing that's very important for interaction of this system with the open ocean is what's called the North Brazilian Current retroflexion, which I'll show you a picture of in a minute. That part of the year, the whole part of the coastal system retroflects across the Atlantic and injects all sorts of things into the middle of the Atlantic Ocean that are derived largely from the sediments on the shelf. And so here qualitatively, you can see that this is an incredibly productive region of the ocean, coastal region. This is the chlorophyll pattern, the annual pattern from a long time ago now, I guess. But it's still the same in that regard. You can see part of the retroflexion here. So it comes off of French Guiana and reaches out across the Atlantic. And here you can see it in a better resolution of what's generating it. It has its source. Many of the nutrients that are advected out into the ocean do not come from the Amazon River itself. It comes from remobilization of sediments along the coastline, the injection into the water column of things like dissolved iron, a range of things, phosphorus, so forth. Now, I'm going to go back to the seasonal patterns, but I want to also appreciate that there are longer term patterns in all these systems. We don't really know too much about them, but this entire coastline varies on a decadal time scale and longer as a function of very large scale climatic conditions. So that's that upper picture. I don't know, is there a pointer here that I could use? I keep putting my hand up there. This seems, oh, there we go. Okay, this is the coast of French Guiana. So those of you, this is Cabo Orange here. And so Cayenne is over here. And going up here to Suriname. And the coast, you can see the average coast position as a function of time, 1950, 1975, 2010. And so you can see it's prograded out and eroded back at various times. So it's very dynamic. And this whole coastline receives about 15 to 20% of the Amazon outfall. So the delta doesn't just stay proximal. The deltaic inputs don't just stay proximal to the Amazon River. They move down the coast and they make for a dynamic coastline. My point here is that this is the total area of mangrove fringe along the French Guiana coastline here as a function of time, 1950, 2000, and present, versus the NAO, the North Atlantic oscillation, okay? Pressure oscillations in the North Atlantic, and this is the wave field as a function of time. This is a 10-year running mean of the NAO index here. And so you can see there's a long-term pattern of change here that drives wave activity along this coastline. So this whole system is also varying, not just seasonally as a function of those things I just showed you, but also on decadal timescales as a function of larger scale climatic types of conditions. Now, back to the more seasonal types of patterns and the more proximal types of processes here. Now, so here's the Amazon River, and as you go out here, you go across the top set, and then out here is where the foreset of this system is. And one of the things that was learned early on in studying this system is that this top set region, which represents about, you can do the math here, or arithmetic, about 50,000 square kilometers of seabed, is intensively disturbed physically. And so these contours here in centimeters, 50, 100, 150 centimeters, represents the thickness of a homogenized zone of lead-210 activity, which tells you that on the time scale of lead-210 decay, which is 22 years, that this sediment pile is completely reworked and mixed. Okay, so it's disturbed frequently enough that the lead-210 profiles are kept vertical. And now if you just measure the volume of sediment in here, it's about 18 gigatons of sediment. And the input from the Amazon is a little less than a gigaton a year, maximum, maybe 600 million metric tons. So you have over 20 years of river discharge locked up into this volume of sediment that's being reworked. That's the incinerator of carbon. Now, to give you a sense of the seasonality of this, Steve Keel, many years ago, looked at different stations. Oh, I should go back and, oh, I can't go back probably. Looked at different stations in that sort of north west part of the system and looked at the thickness of that mixed layer as a function of time. And here you can see, well, it looks pretty constant. Here we're at this station E3. It's about 80 centimeters thick, and then maybe 75, and then 90, and then 110. That's pretty constant in the scheme of natural processes. But if you look at the actual lead-210 profiles that correspond to these different times, you see that they're changing completely. The activity of lead-210 is about 2.5 here, okay, through its thickness here, and here it's up near 4, okay, and here it's back down to 3. that means the sediment has moved all over the place, right? You may get the same thickness of sediment, but it's moved laterally. It's been exchanged. So sediment is not just staying in one place and being resuspended. It's moving all over the place and being mixed laterally as well. Now, one of the things I wanted to show you qualitatively is that these interactions of the seabed, this intensively disturbed seabed with the overlying water, actually incorporates things from the overlying water into the seabed. Okay? The sediment is really part of the water column in many ways. And one of the indicators of that is shown here with the water column copepods are buried in the sediment in that mixed layer I was just showing you to at least 25 centimeters, probably more, but 25 centimeters because that's all that these were measured in. Nobody thought there would be water column organisms entrained into the seabed to such a depth. So you can see these organisms are fresh, their guts are full, in some cases they're alive, and they're in that bottom mixed layer. Another indicator of sediment-water interactions are the radium isotopes, which are very, very sensitive indicators of sediment-water interactions. And this represents the, lock in on the blue one, that's the radium-224 inventory up in the water column on the Amazon shelf as a function of the stage of river flow. And so this is the high flow of the river. This is the rising part of the river system. And you can see there's a huge amount of radium-224 injected into the water column. That comes from the seabed, right? And if you just do a mass balance calculation, which is what Billy Moore did, you find out that this corresponds to about a 50 centimeter depth layer across the whole shelf being reworked. And the radium in that layer is injected into the water column. And I can't go into it here, there's not enough time, but phosphorus comes with that radium, okay? And other things that are generated in sediments during diagenesis are introduced into the water column during these events. But radium tells you how intense and how pervasive that injection is. So that's one of our tools that we can use. And here you can see, here's radium as a function of salinity in the water column. Here's radium-224. Remember, it has a 3.9-day half-life, so it's a really sensitive indicator of processes. Here you can see the tidal injection during spring tide here at this particular station, increased radium in the water column relative to the neap stage, but both of them, neap and spring, are showing maxima here in this mid-salinity region, which if you go over here to a salinity profile on the shelf, here's the salinity here, here's that 25, here's 20. There's a sort of a benthic front that moves back and forth with the tides. The tidal excursion on the Amazon shelf is about 30 kilometers. So every tide, parcels of water go back and forth 30 kilometers, generates fluid mud on the seabed, which is partly responsible for the injection of radium and other nutrients into the water column. Okay, now when the seabed is disturbed and mixed and exposed to oxygen, all the reduced material in it are oxidized, okay, or a large portion of it. This shows the solid phase iron components of the seabed at a station in that same region that Steve Keel did that seasonal mixed depth study. And what you can see here is during parts of the year, there's very little reduced iron in the sediment in the solid phase, and during other parts, it's grown in. So there's this massive oxidation reduction cycle in the sediment that corresponds to this exposure, okay? Incredibly important. And so iron reduction actually, as a result, dominates a lot of the remineralization of carbon. Okay, so this is the kind of thing we have. I've shown this before here earlier. We have mobilization. There's oxygenation of the sediment to some depth. And then because of the tropical origin of this stuff, this iron-rich sediment, once it's oxidized, it stays in periods of iron reduction for long periods. In this case, 6 to 12 months. So as long as you stir up the bottom every 6 to 12 months, you're stuck in an iron reduction stage before it grows into a more reduced state. Now, what else is happening here at the same time? Here's dissolved silica in the pore water versus depth. And you can see seasonally there's exchange of silica in the system. So it injects silica back into the water column too, which enhances diatom production and so forth. And also it, as we'll see, I guess, in other talks here, which I'm not going to go into the processes here, but there are uptake of cations into the sediment during these periods of mobilization that correspond to what's called reverse weathering reactions. That produces CO2. So here's what we have. We have the disturbance to some depth. Here's this underneath material. This is reset to a low value of, let's say, silica, or a low value of reduced iron. And then with time, that region grows back in to higher levels here of pore water, might be CO2, might be phosphate, might be ammonium, might be silicate, and so forth. But we get these non-steady state ingrowth patterns over and over again in the system. And that means if we measure the flux, if we measure diffusive fluxes in the system, they're all out of whack, okay? They're not at steady state. So if you measure the oxygen flux into the sediment, it's not going to match the carbon flux out, okay? And so here's the CO2 flux, diffusive flux in this case, at different stations on the Amazon shelf. You can see very high values here. I noted that there's a poster out in the hallway that has similar values on the Rhone system. So we're in the right ballpark here in any case relative to other systems. And there's a lot of variability, right? And maybe there's a little more diffusive flux of CO2 that we see during the low and falling. Now that's really interesting. It's growing in then, right? So if we measure diffusive flux, that's when it's going to be highest. And if one of the other things that characterizes this shelf is that the CO2 flux and the oxygen flux are not well balanced. There's a lot more CO2, okay, being released from these sediments diffusively as well as ingrowing into the sediment. We've measured the remineralization rates, but the oxygen flux in and the CO2 flux out are not well matched. There's a lot more CO2 flux coming out. This is a direct consequence of that unsteady ingrowth pattern. The oxygen flux is not in steady state with the remineralization of carbon. Now, in the last part of my time, because Shirley has this nice thing there for me to look at, I'm going to switch to the Gulf of Papua and just highlight a few things about that system. I can't go into it in detail because I am time limited, but the Gulf of Papua is right here. Here's the Fly River, the Parari River's over here. If you're familiar with Papua New Guinea, you know Port Moresby's over there. So the Gulf of Papua, this is in millions of metric tons per year. If you know something about these numbers, you know this is more sediment coming into this Gulf than the Mississippi River delivers per year, okay? And this is not, this system, these systems on this island, this mini continent, are not heavily influenced by human activity yet, okay? There's mining up in the highlands of the Fly, but it's relatively minor impact on the island delivery. And if you go around all these arrows up there of what's coming in from the rivers, you'll get to 1.5 Amazons. So this is a huge source of sediment to the ocean. And like the Amazon, it's a highly productive region here. Chlorophyll in the Gulf. Here's a blow up, terrible resolution, but you can see the really high chlorophyll along the river mouth. So I want to try to make a few points here in the time that I have. This is a beautiful cliniform system. These rivers, their inputs kind of meld in the middle of the Gulf of Papua, and you get a big prograding cliniform from the shoreline out. So this is a typical bathymetric profile here in the center of the Gulf of Papua. Foreset, topset. So there's a huge, wide topset region here of this system. And one of the things that characterizes it seasonally is there's a northwest monsoon, winds coming here from shore to sea, and winds coming here during the southeast trades from sea to shore. And during the southeast trades, it's very, very energetic, as I'll show you in a minute. Now, the hydrograph, here's a representative hydrograph of the fly here, relative to the monsoonal forcing, wind forcing of the system. And you can see a low discharge of the fly during the high southeast trade winds. Now, what I wanted to point out here is one of these longer timescales that we have in these systems. During El Nino in this region of the world, the rain sources, the water sources, move off the island, okay, into the Pacific, farther into the Pacific. And so the river hydrograph just drops like crazy. So you get on this island system, this mini continent, the Gulf of Papua system, the deltaic system, responds to El Nino on El Nino timescales, okay? Now, the wind forcing in the system, the seasonal timescales of it, here's the southeast trades. You can see really, really high gusty winds. It's absolutely miserable working here during the southeast trades. And that's why most of the work in this system is done near the during the northwest monsoon. Okay, now, how does the El Nino affect some of this? And how does the wind system affect the behavior of the system? Here's the Fly River, okay? And you're getting turbidity maxima in this region of the Fly during normal flow, and it moves up and down with the tides. And I'll show you some fluid muds that are generated in a minute from that. And most of the sediment goes out here to the northeast and then eventually ends up in the cliniform. But during the southeast trade, some of it goes into the Torres Strait. And over here, during the El Nino, low river flow, you get a lot more estuarine storage of sediment. So this imposes a decadal or episodic type of pattern on this system. A few more minutes. Hang in there. Here's a core from the Bamu Inlet, which is the next river over to the east from the Fly River. And here, a typical tidal cycling of sand and mud that you get in the channel. But the fluid mud is what I wanted to show you. This is another thing we don't really know too much about. How do fluid muds really behave biogeochemically? Couple more points. So these are X-radiographs of the system that show some of the dominance inshore in these inlets, the Perutu inlet, the Pi inlet. You can see these layers in the sediment that show physical stratification indicative of intense reworking of the sediment. As you go offshore into deeper water, here you can see biogenic structures. So you get a transition to benthic communities in this system as the system becomes less physically disturbed. Here's on the top set, you can see that these conditions oscillate back and forth. Physical control and then biological recolonization of the seabed, bioturbated, back and forth. So seasonally different transport processes dominate the seabed. Okay, I'm running out of time here, so I'm just going to make a couple of points about carbon and the benthic communities. Inshore, if you look at what's being burned off during remineralization, it's basically 100% terrestrial organic matter with a minus 29 del C13 value. As you go across the cliniform, the top set, you get a blending of marine and terrestrial organic matter. And then by the time you get into the foreset, you see that what's driving remineralization in the foreset is relatively heavy marine carbon. So the sources are blending across. Now, I'm just going to, too many slides there, but that's the same thing as I was showing you on the Amazon. I was just trying to show you the same kind of phenomena characterize the system. You disturb it, it grows back, unsteady patterns. Now, also in general, the CO2 production that you see in the seabed during the trades is much lower than it is during the monsoon. Okay, there's more carbon that's stored in the seabed, and you can measure its remineralization in the seabed during the monsoonal periods. You come out here on the foreset, there's not much evidence for seasonality out on the foreset. So my point is that there's a lot of response of this system in carbon remineralization. And the benthic communities also respond in these inshore topset regions. They're dominated, the biomass is dominated by bacteria. You come out into the deeper water, much less dominance of bacteria and bigger dominance of macrofauna. Hey, do I get a 50% override like you did? Yeah, I know. I'm just trying to give you some sense. And so I'll just leave you with this. There's lots of different timescales. Seasonality is one of them. Okay. The forcing factors can be progressive on the timescales that we observe the system, periodic on different frequencies, and episodic, okay, like the El Nino type of episode, or in the case of the higher latitude systems that we're going to hear more about, hurricanes, for example. And then I hope I convinced you with some of the data that I showed you that the way these forcing factors are expressed in the system vary from one location to the next, and that the sediment water exchange and import-export processes of these systems are highly time-dependent and dynamic. So, thank you. That's it for me.